Hey everybody, it's Peter Green from Agile for All, coming to you on this lovely Friday with your daily dose of Agile. And on Fridays, we like to talk about humanizing work, the idea of making work better fit for how humans function and humans better capable of doing good work. Today, I want to talk about one of our favorite bits of advice that we give when we're trying to humanize the workplace. A lot of times there's conflict in a team, in an organization. Of course, all humans have conflict. It's natural. A lot of times we disagree on things, and there are big challenges and hard things to solve. Our advice when we're talking to clients that are trying to solve a really hard problem almost always is, let's see if we can find a way to make the problem visible. And what we find is that if we can figure out how to make things visible, almost every time the solution presents itself or the problem almost dissolves. It's like, it's the closest thing to magic we've found. At least making the problem visible allows us to have a more productive conversation about what to do about it. So if you think about in the best case scenario, we have two people that are seeing different sides of a problem, and they don't agree because they're seeing different angles of it. If we could get the other party on each side of that problem to see what the other person is seeing, most of the time that's going to resolve 80% of the conflict, and then we can have a much more productive conversation. Now, this is really core to a lot of the Agile techniques. It's really core to a lot of lean techniques. This idea of making work visible is deeply ingrained in those approaches. You can think of things like even a task board or a Kanban board as a way to make work visible. But how do we make other things visible? I'll give you a few examples. One of my favorite tools to deal with one-on-one conflict or team conflicts or organizational conflict is something that comes from Eli Goldratt and the theory of constraints thinking tools, something called the evaporating cloud. And the evaporating cloud asks us to make the conflict very visible. And we write things down and we make it very clear what the conflict is. And then we start to write out up on a whiteboard or on a flip chart, we start to write out what are the assumptions behind the conflicting choices, and we try to map out what's the shared goal between them, and just making those things visible often, and then challenging the weaker assumptions as we write them out helps us to resolve the conflict almost every time. And so that's another example of making things visible. Almost all of the tools, as I think of tools that we use, whether that be a process or a practice, almost all of them are about making things visible. I'll give you a quick story about one of my favorite examples of this. I was working with a client who we had done some training with. And in our training, we had talked about the benefit of cross-functional teams, how cross-functional teams are more able to deal with complexity in a collaborative way so that you get multiple viewpoints on things and you can get something all the way through to value within a team without relying on outside teams or other groups for dependencies, right? And so we had that conversation, and after the training, one of the leaders of that team went up the chain because they were not structured that way. They were structured in pretty traditional skill-based departments. And they went up the management chain and said, hey, we've learned about this Scrum thing. It seems like we should be able to get a lot of benefit from doing a cross-functional team. That would mean the following. And they didn't get much traction with it because they were really saying, we want to do this because it seems like a good idea. And there's a lot of hassle involved in changing organizational structures and reporting. And even if you don't change the people that people report to, it's a change in decision making and communication. And so they had a hard time getting that done. And they came back to me and they said, Peter, we're just not able to make this change. And so we said, well, okay, let's actually try to make the benefits visible, and let's make the current situation as visible as possible. And so what we did is we sit down and we mapped out the entire process that ideas would flow through to get to delivery and value in this organization. And when we mapped it out, it turned out that there were 4 teams that any idea had to go through. There were 4 or 5 different sources of requests, all of them, in this case, at the director or VP level of requests for the type of work that this team did. And as we mapped it out, we realized that there were dependencies between each of those teams. That meant each team could do a little piece of it, and then it would be waiting for the next team to pick it up, and then it would be waiting for the next team to pick it up, and then it would be waiting for the next team to pick it up. And then, assuming that everything went well, they could deliver the value. And so on average, what they found is that any request would take about 2 months on average to get something through. Now, what was really happening is that there was a wide variance from the fastest things going through and the slowest things, to where if the most powerful VP in that organization wanted something, it got expedited above everything else, and so everything else waited longer. That doesn't change the average amount of time. It just allows the person with the HIPPO process, the highest paid person's opinion of what should be done next, to dominate things. So things were moving quickly if the VP, the executive VP, asked for it. Everything else would get slowed down, but the average amount of time, what we would call lead time, in this case from a request to delivery, was about 2 months to get through all 4 of those teams. And the reality is, as we mapped that out, we realized often by the time something got to the last team, something would have changed in the environment and it had to get kicked back to the original requester to modify it, or a defect was found that would need to then kick back to an earlier team. And so there was a lot of waste involved, a lot of rework involved in that process as well. So we mapped all of that out, and we mapped it out in a big Visio diagram with, average wait times and process times and all, very similar to if you're familiar with something called a value stream map. This is essentially what we created. But the thing was massive and complicated and unwieldy and hard to look at. And simply mapping out the process, visualizing how complicated that process was, already said something interesting. But the other thing we got out of that was, what is the average amount of time it takes for work to get done, that lead time, and what's the average amount of rework? And so we got all of those figures. Then we sat down with some leads from each of those teams and said, just theoretically, if we were able to get a cross-functional team built, and let's say that cross-functional team was doing something like a 2-week sprint, and it had all of the skills from all 4 of these teams, and we could get one of those VPs to play the decision maker, the product owner, on what gets built in what order, so that there wasn't a lot of kind of politics involved, or less politics involved, hopefully. On average, how long do you think it would take to deliver any one item? And those leads got together and they said, we could probably get at least 1 or 2 of those requests done per sprint. So 1 or 2 every 2 weeks instead of 1 every 2 months. So that's a 4x improvement, or a 200% improvement, if my math is correct. 400% improvement. And then we said, and how often is the rework a result of having to kick back to another team? And as they thought through that, and they realized that if all of the skills were present during sprint planning, and even backlog refinement, they would probably prevent 80% of those defects from ever being introduced in the first place. So at the end of this discussion, they said, all right, our projection is that if we did a cross-functional team, we would be 4 times as quick on average with delivering these things. And we would reduce the rework to about 20% of what it was before. We did the math of what this number of people, what the company was paying, what was the fully loaded cost of these employees. We did the math of what the typical return was on any one of these requests. This was in kind of a pricing and promotions space for this company. And on average, a promotion brought in this much additional revenue. Then we could really say it costs us this much now to get this much financial benefit. It takes that long. We could move that to 1/4 of that amount of time with 20% of the defect rate. And they presented that to the general manager of this business unit. And the general manager said, you could save me that, how much per quarter by doing this? Okay, let's do it. And so when we made the business case, by visualizing things and then figuring out the math of that, the problem went away. It solved the problem for them. They wanted to do cross-functional teams for a lot of the reasons that Agile says we should do that. But until they visualized the current process and what the future process would look like, and then did a little bit of the math on that, they couldn't make the case. So visualizing it made the case for them. So that's one story, one example of how just making things visible tends to make problems easily solved in organizations. That's our humanizing work. Make it visible Friday. video. Hopefully you found that useful. If you're enjoying this content, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. Hit the little bell icon next to the notifications if you want, or next to the subscribe button if you want to get notifications of when these videos pop in so you don't miss any. If this particular topic around making work visible you found useful, go ahead and like the video, share it with your friends, and we hope to hear from you in the comments of some examples of when you've made work visible and how that has helped make problems go away in your team or your organization. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Have a great weekend if it's Friday where you are when you're watching this. If not, have a great day.